Hello all, welcome to the Unit 2 exam review for cellular structure and function. The first question is, which statement is not part of the cell theory? Here are some statements that are part of the cell theory. So they are, all cells come from cells, cells are the basic unit of structure and function, and all living things are made of cells. So that means that 1 is covered, 3 is covered, and 4 is covered. And that also means that by process of elimination, the best answer is number 2. So continuing from there, in question number 2, we see that the cell theory states, we have some statements here that are false. The first statement that's false is that all cells have nuclei that contain genetic information, so let's take that out. Choice 2 says organisms that lack certain organelles reproduce by binary fission. It's a type of reproduction. It's not part of the cell theory, as you can see here. And we also have all cells regenerate and contain the same basic structures. While that's true of many cells, that's not part of the cell theory. However, living organisms that are composed of cells that arise from pre-existing cells, that is correct because it's basically right here in this first bullet. So that means the answer is choice 4. For number 3, the invention of the microscope enabled scientists to observe cells, helping them to discover a basic similarity among organisms, which, as contrasted with the other choices about growing plants in a lab, studying the behavior of chordates, which is a type of organism, or determining the number of atoms in a molecule, those are not part of the cell theory and are not common to all living things. All right, question number 4. Muscle cells in athletes often have more mitochondria than muscle cells in non-athletes. As you know, mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell, and they make ATP, which is used for life functions. Of the answer choices provided, the best answer here is that the muscle cells in athletes actually have a greater demand for energy than the muscle cells of non-athletes. I think this makes sense because ATP is the energy molecule for the cell. All right, number 5. In a cell, information that controls the production of proteins must pass from the nucleus to the... So while we know that it's actually the ribosomes that make the proteins, we also can say that DNA is the set of instructions that the ribosomes read to make the proteins. So the nucleus and the ribosomes are very connected in this way. So I think that our best answer in this case is that information passes from the nucleus to the ribosomes. In number 6, in a cell, all organelles work together to carry out. Best answer here is metabolic processes. Remember, metabolism is any chemical reaction in a cell. Number 7, one difference between plant and animal cells is that animal cells do not have, you guessed it, chloroplasts. And that's because chloroplasts are only in plant cells, and in addition, they make glucose from light and carbon dioxide. Now for number 6, we need to consider when we're deciding which compound is organic. We have their formula here. We just need to know that organic reactions, or excuse me, organic compounds are substances that contain both carbon and hydrogen. Therefore, inorganic compounds are ones that do not, in fact, have both carbon and hydrogen. So since this question wants to know the compound that is inorganic, we have to find one that does not contain both carbon and hydrogen. As you go through the answer choices, you can see that choice 1 has carbon and hydrogen, so does choice 2, and so does choice 3, even though choices 1 and 3 contain oxygen additionally, they have at a minimum carbons and hydrogen, so they are considered organic. But choice 4 has carbon but no hydrogen and is therefore the correct answer because that means that it's considered inorganic. So for number 9, which letter indicates a cell structure that directly controls the movement of molecules into and out of the cell? So obviously it's going to be something around the border of the cell. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit for detail on this one. So while this isn't the answer, what I've done is I've highlighted the cell wall in green, and the cell membrane, which is on the inside of the cell wall, is highlighted in blue. And in this case, it's the cell membrane that acts as the structure that controls all the movement of particles into and out of the cell. So that's going to be our answer. For number 10, we can use the same logic as before. Inorganic compounds do not contain both carbon and hydrogen. And specifically in this case, water's formula is H2O. So while it does contain the hydrogen, it does not contain the carbon. And therefore, the correct answer for number 10 is choice 2. Conversely, for number 11, we're charged with determining which compounds are considered organic. Organics are going to contain both carbon and hydrogen. And of the choices I can see here, only molecule A contains atoms of carbon and hydrogen at the same time. So the best answer choice is choice 1. Choice 12 asks us about organisms that have the ability to use an atmospheric gas to produce an organic nutrient. One example of an atmospheric gas is carbon dioxide, and one example of an organic nutrient is glucose. Of course, the rest of this equation, which we call photosynthesis, is here. And that means that if it's photosynthesis, then all of these organisms that can do it are plants. And another word for plant is autotroph. You'll remember from our vocabulary lessons that auto means to do by itself, and troph has to do with feeding and food and energy, so autotrophs feed themselves. 13 and 14 are very similar questions. They both have to do with photosynthesis, which is represented in the equation at right. In number 13 specifically, they want to know about the use of carbon dioxide and water in a geranium plant to synthesize glucose. This, of course, illustrates the process of autotrophic nutrition, which is another name for photosynthesis. Number 14, however, is referring specifically to glucose molecules, which are highlighted here. Glucose is an organic compound because it contains both carbon and hydrogen. So it's organic, but all the things that you see on the left-hand side of the equation are inorganic because they don't contain both carbon or hydrogen. Which means that our best answer is choice 1 because this organic compound, glucose, is made from inorganic compounds. In number 15, we see an experimental setup that has a plant with black paper discs blocking a portion of the leaf itself. Without access to light, then photosynthesis does not occur. Therefore, this setup is probably being used to show that light is necessary for photosynthesis. Number 16 says that bromethymol blue turns yellow in the presence of carbon dioxide. So that sounds like it's a substance that changes color to indicate the presence of another substance, which is another term for indicators. So the best answer is choice 2, indicator. Number 17 is a reaction that has carbon dioxide and water turning into glucose and water and oxygen. This, of course, is photosynthesis, which is a process that takes place inside chloroplasts. A chloroplast is just an organelle which is specialized to do photosynthesis in plant cells. And in general, whenever you have a structure that's specialized to do any life function, it's called an organelle, which is, of course, a word that means little organ. So in number 19, you can see that the question is asking about studies of fat cells and thyroid cells, and that fat cells have fewer mitochondria than thyroid cells. A biologist would most likely infer that fat tissue requires less energy than thyroid tissue. And the reason for that is that mitochondria are the organelles that release ATP. In number 20, we have a nice little flowchart started. It starts with light energy, and it says it's captured in the process of photosynthesis, which is a process that takes place in a chloroplast. And it continues to store that energy in a molecule called glucose. And then glucose is going to be used in a process called cellular respiration, which of course happens in an organelle called the mitochondrion. That was extra. In any case, what we put in boxes A, B, and C were photosynthesis, glucose, and cellular respiration. So that means our best answer choice is going to be choice 3. That's because glucose is an organic molecule. Its formula is C6H12O6, and carbon and hydrogen containing compounds are organic. This question is based on our state-mandated lab making connections. You can see a histogram here that's similar to the one you created in class. But the question itself says that in this case, pulse rate data was collected from students during their lunch time instead of after exercise. So question 21 says, state a way that data would most likely be different if the pulse rates were collected after exercising instead of during lunch. So these pulse rates are lower than they would be if you had been exercising. However, if a pulse rate gets really low, like around 45, as you can see, not really many people had below 51 in this data. If a pulse gets really low, you would have trouble with the following things. You would have trouble getting enough glucose, oxygen, and water to your cells. And you would have trouble getting enough CO2 and other waste products removed. You remember from state-mandated lab that a histogram sums from the totals of each column. So there are 3 plus 4 plus 6 plus 7 plus 4 plus 3 for a total of 27 students. This page also has some questions from our state-mandated lab. You can see here that this is a data table of a student who counted his pulse 3 times for a 20-second pulse each time. And in the first 20-second interval, he had 23 pulses. In the second 20-second interval, he had 26 pulses. And in the third, it was 21 pulses. But remember that this is a 20-second interval, and we're actually asking for the pulses per minute. So 20 seconds occurs 3 times in 1 minute or 60 seconds. So that means each of these intervals that have been recorded by the student should be multiplied by 3. Let me get out my calculator. And I got 69, 78, and 63 for an average of 70. The way I get that number, the average, is by adding the 3 values together and dividing them by 3 because there are 3 values. So basically, I have answered number 25. Now, when we come back to number 24, what additional data should the student have collected in order to determine the effect of squeezing a closed pin on his pulse rate? So basically, the student has been squeezing the closed pin and he counted his pulses. But if he really wants to know what the effect of squeezing is, then he really needs to know what his normal pulse rate is. And that is the end of this presentation. I hope that you feel prepared for the exam, but you should also be studying your note cards.